So we just finished speaking about higher order functions, but there's actually a bunch of really cool things that are left to do. And so this is higher order functions part 2. And so let's continue our study of higher order functions. So we're going to primarily talk about two things only in this part of this course. We're going to talk about returning functions from functions, and then a concept called closure, which is a pretty interesting kind of it's an interesting feature that JavaScript gives us in order to use functional programming. So first, let's talk about returning values from functions. And so we know that functions can return values, right? Simply, which is that when you have a function, it returns something. When you call that function, it returns something, and then when you console log that return thing, you get it. So that's good. But we also learned in the previous unit that functions are like any other value. So I guess we should be able to return functions as well, right? Yes. So so let's say we have a function, simple function called greetMe. All it does is console log hi. And then we have another function called getGreeter. And what this does is that it returns greetMe. Okay? So if somebody were to call getGreeter, they could actually set a variable equal to the return of getGreeter, and they would actually have greetMe, right? So for example, if we do let greeter equals getGreeter, then basically getGreeter will send greetMe into here. Now I know this is a contrived example, but this is just to get you to understand the concept of returning a function, right? The other thing to note here is that notice how there's no open close parentheses here. So we're not actually calling greetMe, we are just returning it. So there's no open close parentheses. Down here though, we are calling getGreeter, right? So getGreeter is called, greetMe would be returned, and then greeter will just hold the value of greetMe. So essentially greeter will have this, will be the same as the greetMe's reference. If this code were to be run, basically nothing really would happen with this line. For console log, so if we were to console log type of greeter, we will realize that that it is a function, and then if we console log greeter, we'll kind of get the standard function to string representation that we've been seeing. And then if we run greeter, it should be the same as running greetMe, right? Because it was returned with getGreeter. So let's try that. There we go. So so you can see that the first console log gave function, then we got the function to string, and then we got hi, which is the return of greetMe. Okay, cool. So let's see if we so in the previous slide we just returned greetMe without invoking it. If we did invoke it, this whole thing would be a little bit kind of a little messed up, because what would happen is that getGreeter, instead of returning the greetMe function itself, instead of returning a reference to the greetMe function, it would return the return value of greetMe, right? So essentially, this will return what? Because greetMe doesn't actually return anything; it just console logs. So this will just have essentially undefined, right? And so the type of greeter, so greeter will be undefined. So type of greeter should be undefined. Console log greeter will also give undefined, and then if you try to run undefined, you will get undefined is not a function, something like that, right? And so there you go. So you get hi first because of this, right? Like, because right before you returned it, you run greetMe, and so you get that hi, right when this is run. But then once because the return of this is just undefined, and so greeter will only be undefined, right? Because greetMe actually doesn't even return anything. So when you return a function that doesn't return anything, it will return undefined. So getGreeter will return undefined, greeter will then be equal to undefined, and so that's why we see undefined here and here. Okay, makes sense. So now here, in our current examples, we've been defining functions kind of, one at a time outside, but actually functions like variables or other types of values can also be defined inside other functions, right? So we can actually define a greetme function inside the getGreeter function and then return it immediately right there, right? So we can, whenever somebody says getGreeter, we define a new greetme function and we return it. So it's kind of like a greeter generator. And so then we could do letGreeter equals getGreeter, right? So getGreeter would be called, it would create greetme and return it, and so greeter would be equal to greetme. And then if we call, if we were to call this, we would get hi. But the key thing to learn here is that we are defining this function inside this other function, and every time this function is called, this kind of a new function will be created here and returned. Okay. Cool. So next, so let's see if we can return anonymous functions. So like in the previous version of getGreeter, we were actually defining the function as greetme. So here we're just returning a anonymous function, right? It has the same kind of functionality as greetme did, but there's no reason for the name greetme, right? Because all we're doing is we're just returning it, and then somebody's going to have to catch that return and put it in a variable anyway, which we are doing here. So then there's no reason for the name, and so anonymous function is a lot easier to. It's just a lot shorter, and so if we do letGreeter equals getGreeter, and then we call greeter, we will get we basically get hi. Okay, so let's kind of set up the next topic here, which is what if our return function took a parameter? Would that work? So, if we are returning this anonymous function and it takes a parameter, will we be able to use that return value in the same way that we would use any other function that takes a parameter? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? Why would I ask that question? But yeah, the answer is yes. So here, we've set up this function where getGreeter returns a simple function that takes a name and then outputs hi name, right? So console logs hi name. And here I'm writing letGreeter equals getGreeter. So now greeter is this anonymous function right here, right? So greeter is this anonymous function, which means that when you call greeter, you need to pass a name in order for this to say hi name as such, right? So when we call greeter, let's pass in Marie, and then Marie should, so then we should see the output of hi Marie. If we pass in other names, then we should see those as well. And if we call greeter without passing anything in, what will happen is that name will be undefined, and so we will see the like a printed version of undefined here. So you can see right here, if we call these three things, we see the following values. So this kind of brings us to our next. It kind of brings us to our next topic of closure. But before we get into closure, we want to do a quick recap of scope. This is from a recap from a previous lecture. And so let's just review how scope works with nested functions, right? And so functions create a scope in the sense that they can, so variables that are created inside of the function are accessible inside of the function, but after that function, generally after that function is finished executing, those variables are not accessible anymore because they're only accessible in that functional scope, okay? If you create a function inside of a function, then that inside function can access the variables of the outside function, okay? Because a lower scope can access things from the higher scope, right? But the higher scope can't access things from the lower scope. So the outside function could not access the variables in the inside function, but the inside function can access everything from the outside. Okay, so let's just see an example of that. Let's say we had a function greeter, let name equals Marie, and then if we so notice that we are using the name variable here, and our name is actually defined up here, right? So our name is defined technically in the greeter. It's defined in the greeter function, and then we are able to use it in this other function right here, says hi, right? And so when we call says hi, this will actually work because it will have access to it. Now, if we had tried to use name down here, it wouldn't work because name is in, name is defined in this function's scope, right? It wouldn't be available in the higher scope, which is kind of above or below, but it would be available inside. If you make another function inside, it will be available in that scope. And so if we call greeter, we should be seeing hi Marie, which we do, because name is available. So now what is closure? Because there is something happening here. There is a closure happening even in the code that you see in front of you right now. And so let's first define closure. So closure is a fact that a inner function can still access the values defined in the outer function even after the outer function has finished running. Okay, so this will take a moment to really to understand. I think examples are best. And so if we look at this same kind of example from before, so we have this kind of get greeter function. We're defining a name, right, Marie, and then we have a function returned from the get greeter that uses the name that's defined here. Okay, so just think about how this would work. So when we call get greeter, we are going to define name, right? And we're going to return this function, and then this get greeter function is done executing. And so technically, since name is defined in the scope of get greeter, name should be gone. It shouldn't be available anywhere. But what closure is that if a variable is used inside of a function, and that function remains alive in a sense, so like because this function is returned and greeter has access to this function, the value of name remains alive. So like JavaScript closes over the value of name and still keeps it available to you, even though the value is coming from this getGreeter function and that getGreeter function has finished executing, right? And so like you have greeter, so after this line you can use greeter again and again and again, and it should still work. So like if we call greeter here, you should see that greeter is getGreeter is running, so we're right here. GetGreeter finished, so right here, right? GetGreeter is finishing right here, and still, so greeter was called down here, right? And so this function is done executing when getGreeter is finishing gets called. So isn't it cool how the Marie is still available to us? And so that's what a closure is that so this function right here, this anonymous function, is the closure where it's closing over the value of name, and that value of name is kept alive as long as greeter is alive, right? It kind of like holds that value because JavaScript knows that the value of this variable was necessary, obviously, to the running of this function, right? And so it keeps it around, and that's what closure is. And so now, what if getGreeter took a parameter, right? So if getGreeter took a parameter like this, so instead of defining it, so on the previous page we were defining name, we were like hard coding name to be Marie right inside, right? So what if instead this was just a parameter name and any name could be passed in? Would closure still work? The answer is yes. So if we pass in another name, Rosalind, and we call greeter, then we still get hi Rosalind. Like the parameter can still be closed over in the same way that the explicitly defined variable name was closed over. Okay? And so even if both functions took parameters, right, in this way, right, like let's say getGreeter took a parameter, and even the anonymous function that we return also took a parameter. Even if both of them took parameters, like the closure still stands. So like now, let's say that getGreeter is called with Marie, right? So Marie gets put in name1, and it returns a function that takes something that's name2. Now name2 is still not defined at this point because greeter is just a function that takes a variable, right? And we're going to call that variable name2. Name2 is not defined, but name1's value, Marie, has been closed over by this function right here, okay? And so then we call greeter, and we pass in Rosalind as name2, because greeter is just this function right here. So then we pass function and name2, and then let's see what happens, right? Because then you'll see that both name1 and name2 are actually maintained in are actually maintained. So like it, of course, now you can keep calling greeter with different names, but Marie will always remain here because Marie was closed over by this closure function when it was called. Okay, cool. And so if we did another example where we let's say, so we call getGreeter, we pass in Marie, and we say introduce Marie to, and then we do another getGreeter and we pass in Rosalind. So now we have two functions that have closed over two different values, right? So it's like the same function has closed over two different values, right? So this same function is called twice with different values for the closure. So let's see if that works. So introduce Marie to Dorothy, and introduce Marie to Albert, introduce Rosalind to Barbara and Isaac. And so look at that. So even though it's the same function, it was able to close over two different versions of name1, right? So here it closed over name1 being Marie, and then when we called it again, we closed over name1 being equal to Rosalind. And so you can see that both of these functions can then be used, you don't have to call them one after the other. You can call them as and when you want, but the value of name1 here will remain defined. And so, this is what's really cool about closure. I mean, this whole concept of closure, you will see it much more, and you will see it frequently. But it's something that, if you find it confusing, feel free to watch this part again. There's also a lot of other reading that you can do online. I mean, it is something that people find confusing initially. But once you kind of get a hang of it, it's really not all that, it's not really all that much more complicated. Essentially, if there was a value that a function needed to run and that function stays alive, then JavaScript will close over that value to make sure that it's available for that function, right? And so yeah, I urge you to watch this part again if necessary. Just to do a quick recap, we talked about returning functions from functions, and we talked about closure, and so so you've really gotten a chance to dive into higher order functions. Higher order functions are really where there's a ton of power in JavaScript. You're going to keep learning more and more about how to use functions in a really cool and crazy ways. But I hope that you have, I hope you feel good about yourself, because this is a pretty complicated concept. It takes experienced programmers a long time to really get a hang of it. And so that's it. Until next time, thank you.